The silence wrapped around Josephine Harper like a shroud the morning she stepped off the dusty stagecoach in Santa Fe, New Mexico, her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone in the busy plaza could hear it. It was the spring of 1876, and the high desert air felt thin in her lungs as she clutched her worn carpet bag and fought the urge to climb right back into that coach and disappear. But there was nothing to go back to, not after the fever had taken both her parents within days of each other back in Kansas, leaving her with nothing but debts and a distant aunt who had grudgingly agreed to take her in. The plaza bustled with life that made Josephine's chest tighten. Merchants called out their wares in English and Spanish. Horses stamped and snorted at hitching posts. Women in bright shawls laughed together near the old adobe church. She stood frozen, her throat closing up the way it always did when she needed to speak to anyone, especially men. The stagecoach driver had already tossed down her trunk and driven away before she could force out even a whispered thank you. She was 20 years old and still could not manage what seemed so easy for everyone else. Words lodged in her throat like stones whenever a man looked at her directly. Her mother had called it shyness, her father had called it stubbornness, but Josephine knew it was something deeper, something that made her feel like her voice did not deserve to take up space in the world. The address her aunt had sent was for a boarding house on the east side of the plaza. Josephine picked up her trunk, struggling with its weight, and started walking. She kept her eyes down, focusing on the packed earth beneath her worn boots, trying not to notice the people who had to step around her. She had made it perhaps 20 feet when a massive shadow fell across her path. Josephine stopped, her heart leaping into her throat. Slowly, she lifted her gaze, taking in scuffed leather boots, buckskin trousers, a chest so broad it seemed to block out half the sun, and finally, a face weathered by wind and sun, framed by dark hair that fell past his shoulders. The man stood well over 6 feet tall, his arms thick with muscle, his hands large enough to probably span her entire waist. He was looking at her, waiting for something, and she realized with rising panic that he must have spoken to her and she had been too lost in her own fear to hear. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. Heat flooded her face. The man's expression shifted from expectation to something gentler. His eyes, she noticed, were a striking pale blue against his tanned skin, and they held no impatience, no mockery. "You need help with that trunk, miss?" he asked, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to resonate in her bones. Josephine wanted to say yes, wanted to tell him she was looking for Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, wanted to ask if he knew where it was. Instead, she managed only the smallest nod, her cheeks burning with shame. The man did not seem bothered by her silence. He simply bent, lifted her heavy trunk as if it weighed nothing at all, and settled it against his shoulder. Then he waited, patient as stone. She pointed in the direction she had been heading, and he nodded. "I will walk with you then. My name is Yates Brennan. I trap up in the mountains, but I come down for supplies every few weeks." He started walking, adjusting his pace to match hers. Josephine felt the curious stares of people they passed, wondering what this giant of a man was doing with the quiet mouse of a girl who could not even speak. But Yates Brennan did not seem to expect conversation. He pointed out the mercantile as they passed it, mentioned that the blacksmith made the best horseshoes in the territory, and noted that the cantina on the corner served food that would burn the tongue right out of your mouth if you were not careful. He asked no questions that required answers, made no comments about her silence. By the time they reached the boarding house, a squat adobe building with bright blue shutters, Josephine's heart had slowed to something approaching normal. Mrs. Henderson turned out to be Josephine's aunt, though she introduced herself with her married name and the stiff formality of someone doing an unpleasant duty. She was a thin woman with iron-gray hair and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. She looked Yates up and down with obvious disapproval. "You can put that in the hall," she said curtly. "Josephine will be staying in the back room. I expect help with the cooking and cleaning in exchange for room and board." Yates set the trunk down carefully and tipped his head to Josephine. "Good luck to you, miss." She wanted to thank him, wanted to tell him how much his kindness had meant after such a long and lonely journey, but the words would not come. She managed only a small smile, hoping it conveyed even a fraction of her gratitude. Something flickered in those pale blue eyes, something warm, before he turned and walked back out into the bright New Mexico sunshine. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that felt like wearing a coat several sizes too small. Josephine woke before dawn to start the breakfast fire, scrubbed floors until her knees ached, cooked meals for the half-dozen boarders who rented rooms from her aunt, and fell into bed each night too exhausted to do more than stare at the ceiling. Her aunt spoke to her only to issue orders, and the boarders quickly learned that the quiet girl who served their meals would not respond to their greetings or attempts at conversation. Most of them stopped trying after the first week. All except Mr. Thornton, a clerk at the Mercantile who had a thin mustache and hands that always seemed to be reaching for things that did not belong to him. He sat too close, spoke too loudly, asked questions he knew she would not answer, and then laughed at her silence. Josephine learned to serve his plate last and leave the room as quickly as possible. She had been in Santa Fe for 3 weeks when Yates Brennan appeared at the boarding house door on a Tuesday morning. Mrs. Henderson answered his knock, and Josephine heard her aunt's suspicious voice from where she stood in the kitchen, up to her elbows in bread dough. "We do not have any rooms available." "I am not looking for a room, madam." That deep voice sent an unexpected warmth through Josephine's chest. "I am heading back up to my camp and wondered if Miss Harper might need anything from the mountains. I pass through here regular and thought I could bring her letters or such if she had family elsewhere." There was a long pause. "My niece has no one but me, and she has work to do. Good day." The door closed firmly. Josephine stood motionless, her hands still buried in the dough, feeling something twist painfully in her chest. He had remembered her name. He had thought of her, this mountain man she had met only once, and he had come back. That night, she lay awake thinking about pale blue eyes and patient silence. Yates came back 2 weeks later. This time, Josephine was in the front room, mending a tear in one of the boarders' shirts, when she heard his voice at the door. Her needle stilled. "Brought some fresh venison for the house," he was saying. "Got more than I can use before I head back up." Mrs. Henderson accepted the meat with grudging thanks, but she did not invite him in. When she closed the door, she turned to find Josephine watching from her seat by the window. "That mountain man has taken an interest in you," her aunt said, her tone making it clear this was not a positive development. "You would do well to discourage it. Men like that are barely civilized. They live like animals in the wilderness." Josephine dropped her gaze back to her mending, but her heart was racing. An interest in her? The idea seemed impossible. She was nothing, nobody, a girl who could not even speak. But 3 weeks later, Yates was back again, and 3 weeks after that. Each time he brought something for the boarding house, venison or rabbit, fresh trout from the mountain streams, wild herbs that Mrs. Henderson grudgingly admitted made good tea. And each time, he asked if he might see Miss Harper, just to say hello. Mrs. Henderson refused every time, until the day in late summer when Mr. Thornton cornered Josephine in the narrow hallway outside the kitchen. She had been carrying a bucket of water, and he stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "Pretty thing like you should not be so unfriendly," he said, his breath smelling of whiskey though it was barely past noon. "I'm starting to think you believe you are too good for a gentleman like me." Josephine tried to step around him, but he moved with her, his hand reaching out to touch her arm. She jerked back, water sloshing from the bucket, her heart hammering with fear and a rising sense of being trapped. "Now, do not be like that. I just want to hear your voice. Surely you can manage a few words." She shook her head frantically, pressing herself against the wall, wishing she could disappear into the adobe itself. "Leave her be." Yates Brennan's voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made Mr. Thornton spin around, his face flushing. The mountain man filled the back doorway, and he looked bigger somehow than Josephine remembered, his shoulders nearly touching both sides of the frame, his expression carved from stone. "This is none of your concern," Mr. Thornton blustered. "I was just having a conversation." "The lady does not want conversation." Yates took a step inside, and Mr. Thornton retreated. "And you know it. The lady does not speak, so how would anyone know what she wants? Some folks know how to listen without needing words." Another step. Yates moved like something wild and dangerous, controlled but capable of explosive violence. "You going to make me ask you again to leave her be?" Mr. Thornton looked at Josephine, then at Yates, and apparently decided his pride was not worth whatever might happen next. He brushed past Yates and disappeared out the back door. Josephine heard him muttering about savages and improper women, but she barely registered the words. She was staring at Yates, at the concern in his eyes as he looked at her. "You all right, miss?" She nodded, not trusting herself to even try to speak. "That fellow bother you before?" She hesitated, then nodded again. Shame washed through her. She was such a coward, unable to defend herself, unable to even tell someone she needed help. Yates seemed to read something in her expression. Nothing shameful about not wanting unwanted attention, or about finding it hard to speak up. Some people are loud as magpies and some keep their thoughts closer. Neither is wrong. Tears pricked at Josephine's eyes. In 20 years, no one had ever said anything like that to her. Everyone had always treated her silence like a failing, something she needed to fix, a deficiency that made her less than other people. Mrs. Henderson appeared then, drawn by the commotion, and the moment shattered. But something had shifted. When Yates left that day, after telling Mrs. Henderson that Mr. Thornton had been inappropriate with her niece, Josephine watched from the window. He paused in the plaza, turned, and looked back at the boarding house. Their eyes met across the distance, and she lifted her hand in a small wave. He smiled, a real smile that transformed his weathered face, and touched his fingers to his forehead in a salute before walking away. Mr. Thornton moved out that evening. Mrs. Henderson made it clear he was not welcome to return, but she also made it clear that she did not approve of Yates Brennan's involvement. "You will not encourage that man," she told Josephine that night as they cleaned up after supper. "I agreed to take you in as a Christian duty, but I will not have you bringing shame on this house by consorting with a mountain ruffian." Josephine kept scrubbing the pot in her hands, but something inside her had begun to kindle, some small flame of defiance. When Yates came back 5 weeks later, in early October with the aspens turning gold in the mountains, Josephine was sweeping the front step. She saw him coming across the plaza, and her heart did something complicated in her chest. He was dressed in buckskin and fur, his long hair tied back, and he moved with the easy grace of someone completely comfortable in his own skin. He stopped at the foot of the step and looked up at her. "Miss Harper." She gripped the broom handle, her knuckles white. "I know your aunt does not approve of me stopping by, and I know you find it hard to talk to folks, but I wanted you to know that I think about you, up there in the mountains. I wonder if you are all right, if that Thornton fellow has stayed away, if you are happy here." Josephine's chest felt too tight. She opened her mouth, tried to force sound past the blockage in her throat, but nothing came. Frustration burned behind her eyes. "You do not have to say anything," Yates said gently. "I just wanted you to know, and to give you this." He pulled something from his pocket and set it on the step. It was a small carving she saw, a deer no bigger than her palm, rendered in smooth pine with exquisite detail. "Made it during the long evenings. Thought you might like it." He touched his fingers to his forehead again, that little salute that was becoming familiar, and turned to go. "Wait." The word came out as barely more than a whisper, scratched and rough from lack of use, but it was a word. Josephine's own voice speaking. Yates stopped mid-step and turned back slowly, his eyes wide. She stood frozen, shocked at herself, the broom clattering to the ground. She had spoken. To a man. The thing she had never been able to do, the impossible thing, and the word had just slipped out because the thought of him leaving without knowing how much his kindness meant was suddenly unbearable. "You spoke," he said, and there was wonder in his voice. Josephine nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks, overwhelmed by fear and relief and something else she could not name. "That is the finest gift anyone has ever given me, hearing your voice," Yates said softly. He took a step closer, his expression tender. "Can you say something else? Or was that all you had?" She wanted to say so much. "Thank you for the deer. Thank you for being patient. Thank you for seeing me when everyone else looks through me. Thank you for making me feel like maybe my silence is not a sin." But the words were a dam behind her teeth, and only one more trickled through. "Thank you." His smile could have lit the whole plaza. "You are mighty welcome, Miss Harper." Mrs. Henderson's voice cracked from inside like a whip. "Josephine, get in here this instant." The spell broke. Josephine snatched up the carved deer and fled inside, her heart pounding so hard she felt dizzy. Her aunt stood in the hallway, fury radiating from every inch of her thin frame. "I told you to stay away from that man. Did I not make myself clear?" Josephine clutched the carving, still feeling the echo of her own voice in her throat. She met her aunt's eyes and did something she had never done before. She shook her head in refusal. "Do not defy me, girl. You are here because I took pity on you. You have nothing, no prospects, no abilities beyond scrubbing floors. That mountain man may have turned your head with his rough charm, but I will not allow you to throw yourself away on a life of hardship and poverty." I spoke to him. The words came easier this time, though still quiet. I've never spoken to any man before, not once, but I spoke to Yates. Her aunt's face went through several expressions, settling finally on calculation. "Oh, is that so? Well, I suppose that is progress. But there are better matches for you than a wilderness trapper. If you can speak, you can make yourself useful in more ways than cleaning. I will speak to Mr. Ferguson at the Mercantile. He is a widower, respectable, with a good business." Horror flooded through Josephine. Mr. Ferguson was at least 50 years old, with 3 nearly grown children and a reputation for being demanding. "No. No? You ungrateful child. Do you think you have choices here? Do you think men will be lining up for a penniless girl who spent the first 20 years of her life unable to speak?" Maybe her aunt was right. Maybe Josephine should be grateful for any offer of security, any escape from a life of servitude. But when she closed her eyes, she saw Yates Brennan smile, felt the way her voice had emerged when she called out to him, and she knew that if she let her aunt bully her into a loveless marriage with a man who saw her as merely useful, that small flame inside her would gut her out forever. "I will not marry Mr. Ferguson." Mrs. Henderson's hand cracked across Josephine's cheek before she could react. "You will do as you are told. This is my house, and you live here on my sufferance. Get to your room, and do not come out until you are ready to apologize and accept your position." Josephine fled, but not from fear. She ran to her tiny room and closed the door, leaning against it, her cheeks stinging and her heart racing with something that felt almost like triumph. She had spoken. She had refused. She had claimed for the first time in her life some small piece of agency. She looked down at the carved deer in her hand, at the care evident in every smooth curve, and whispered into the empty room, "Yates." His name felt like a promise. The next morning, her aunt informed her that Mr. Ferguson would be coming to dinner that Saturday and expected to be impressed. Josephine served breakfast in silence, but it was a different silence now, weighted with decision. She had 3 days. She spent those days thinking about the mountains, about freedom, about a man patient enough to wait for a whispered word. She thought about spending the rest of her life serving meals to boarders and scrubbing floors, or becoming Mr. Ferguson's useful wife, a replacement mother for his children and keeper of his house. And she thought about pale blue eyes that looked at her like she mattered. On Saturday morning, before dawn, Josephine packed her carpet bag with her few possessions. She left behind the dresses her aunt had given her, too fine to have been meant kindly, and kept only the simple work dresses she had brought from Kansas. She added the carved deer, wrapped carefully in a handkerchief. Then she waited for the house to wake. Her aunt found the note propped on the kitchen table. It said only, "I am sorry. I cannot be who you want me to be. Thank you for taking me in. Josephine." By the time Mrs. Henderson read it, Josephine was already halfway across the plaza, her heart in her throat, walking toward the trading post where she knew the trappers and mountain men sold their furs. She had no plan beyond finding someone who might know where Yates Brennan made his camp. It was foolish, reckless, the kind of thing the old Josephine would never have dreamed of doing. But the old Josephine had never spoken to a man, had never felt her voice emerge like a bird from a cage. The trading post smelled of leather and tobacco and fur, and the man behind the counter looked her up and down with open curiosity. "Help you, miss?" Josephine opened her mouth and felt the familiar panic, the closing of her throat. But she forced herself to think of Yates, of his patience, and the words came out in a rush. "I am looking for Yates Brennan, the trapper. Do you know where I can find him?" The man's eyebrows rose. "Yates? He's up in the Sangre de Cristo range, has a camp near the headwaters of the Pecos River. But that is a hard 3-day ride from here, and no place for a young lady on her own." "Can you tell me how to get there?" "I can, but I would not advise it. The trail is rough, and there are dangers. Mountain lions, bears, weather that can turn on you in an instant." "Please," she met his eyes, letting him see her desperation. "I have to find him. The trader studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "You are that girl from the boarding house, are not you? The one Yates has been bringing meat to all summer. He spoke of you, said you were gentle as a doe and just as skittish." Warmth flooded through her at the thought of Yates speaking about her to others. "Yes, I need to see him." "Well, I cannot in good conscience send you up there alone. But it so happens that old Miguel is heading up that way this afternoon with some supplies for the camps. If you can be ready by midday, I will ask if you can ride along." Relief nearly buckled her knees. "Thank you. Thank you so much." Miguel turned out to be a weathered Mexican man with silver hair and a kind smile. He asked no questions about why a young woman wanted to travel into the mountains to find a trapper, just gestured for her to climb into the back of his wagon among the bundles of supplies and cluck to his mules. They left Santa Fe behind as the sun climbed toward noon. Josephine watched the adobe buildings grow smaller, felt no regret for leaving the boarding house, only a rising mixture of terror and hope. What would she say when she found Yates? What if he did not want her there? What if his kindness had been just that, kindness, and she was reading far more into it than he had ever meant? But she thought of his smile when she had spoken his name, the wonder in his voice, and she held on to that. The journey into the mountains was nothing like anything Josephine had experienced. The wagon jolted over rough trails, climbing steadily through pinon and juniper that gave way to ponderosa pine and eventually to tall spruce and aspen. The air grew thinner and cooler. Miguel shared his jerky and hard bread, and when they stopped for the night, he made a fire and showed her how to wrap herself in a blanket in a way that kept the chill at bay. "Yates is a good man," he said as they sat by the fire that first night. "Quiet, like you. Keeps to himself. Does not come to town except when he needs to. But he has honor. He pulled my nephew out of a flooded river 3 years back, near drowned himself doing it. You could do worse than a man like that." Josephine stared into the flames, gathering her courage. "Do you think he will want me there?" Miguel chuckled. "Child, that man carved you a deer out of wood. A man does not do that unless his heart is involved. The question is whether you are prepared for the life. The mountains are beautiful, but they are hard. Winters are long and brutal. You would be far from other people, from the comforts of town. You would have to be strong." "I am stronger than I look," Josephine said quietly, and realized it was true. She had survived losing her parents, had endured her aunt's cold household, had spent her whole life trapped by her own fear, and was now breaking free. That took its own kind of strength. On the afternoon of the third day, Miguel's wagon rumbled into a clearing beside a rushing creek. Several cabins dotted the area, rough structures built from logs, each spaced well apart from the others. Miguel pointed to the largest one. "That is Yates's place. Built it himself 5 years ago. Go on now. I will wait here until I see that he is home, and you are welcome. If there is any trouble, you call out." Josephine climbed down from the wagon, her legs stiff from the long ride, her heart hammering against her ribs. She walked up to the cabin, noting the neat stack of firewood, the furs stretched on racks to dry, the general air of well-maintained order. The door was open to let in the autumn sunshine. She stopped at the threshold and tried to call out, but her voice failed her again. The old fear rose up, stealing her words. She stood there, frozen, until a shadow moved inside and Yates appeared in the doorway. He stopped dead at the sight of her, his eyes going wide with shock. "Miss Harper?" She nodded, tears already starting because she could not speak, could not explain why she was here, could not tell him everything she needed him to know. "Josephine?" He said her first name like it was something precious. "What are you doing here? Is something wrong? Did someone hurt you?" She shook her head frantically, trying to force words out, but the old blockage was back, stronger than ever, and she felt the familiar despair washing over her. Yates stepped out of the cabin, moving slowly like she was a wild thing that might bolt. "It is all right. You do not have to talk. Just tell me yes or no. Can you do that?" She nodded, grateful. "Did you come here because you wanted to see me?" Another nod. "Did your aunt send you away?" She shook her head no, then nodded yes. Trying to convey the complexity and frustration made her want to scream. Yates smiled, that warm smile that made her insides melt. "It is all right. I think I understand. Let me ask Miguel what happened, and then we will figure this out together, all right?" She nodded, relief flooding through her. He was not angry. He was not sending her away. Yates walked past her to where Miguel waited with the wagon, and the two men spoke in low voices. Josephine could not hear the words, but she saw Miguel gesturing, saw Yates's expression shift from concern to something else, something that made her pulse quicken. When he walked back to her, his eyes were bright with an emotion she dared not name. "Miguel says you left your aunt's house and asked how to find me, that you traveled 3 days into the mountains to get here. Is that true?" She nodded. "Why?" The single word hung between them, heavy with meaning. Josephine looked at this man, this mountain man who had been nothing but patient and kind, who had waited for her words without demanding them, who had carved her a deer and asked nothing in return. And she thought about spending the rest of her life wondering what might have been if she did not find the courage now. She stepped closer to him, so close she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. Her hand lifted, trembling, and touched his chest, feeling the solid warmth of him beneath the buckskin. Then she reached up and laid her palm against his bearded cheek. "Yates," she whispered. His breath caught. His hand came up to cover hers where it rested against his face, dwarfing her small fingers. "Say it again. Yates. Easier this time. I came because of you. Because when I am near you, I can speak. Because you make me feel like maybe I am not broken." "You were never broken, Josephine. Never." He turned his head and pressed a kiss to her palm, the gesture so tender it made her chest ache. "But I am just a trapper. I live rough, up here alone for months at a time. I do not have much to offer a lady like you. I am not a lady. I am just a girl who cannot talk to people and does not fit anywhere in the world, except maybe here, with you. You do fit here." His other hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing away the tears on her cheek. "You fit with me. I've been thinking about you since the day I saw you in that plaza, looking lost and scared and so beautiful it made my chest hurt. I've been trying to court you proper, bringing meat, trying to find excuses to see you, but I never dared hope you might feel the same." "I feel more than the same," she whispered. "I think I've been waiting my whole life to find someone who understands silence." He kissed her then, soft and careful, like she was something infinitely valuable. Josephine had never been kissed before, had never been held, but with Yates, it felt natural as breathing. She melted into his embrace, into the strength of his massive arms around her, and felt like she had finally come home. When they broke apart, Miguel was calling out his goodbyes and heading his wagon back down the mountain trail. Yates waved to him, then looked down at Josephine with a mixture of joy and concern. "You are sure about this? About me? Because if you stay, people will talk. Your aunt will say terrible things, and the life here is not easy." "I am sure," she said, and her voice was steady. "I am more sure of this than I have been of anything." The cabin Yates had built was simple but well made. A single large room with a sleeping loft, a stone fireplace, and windows that looked out over the valley. He showed her around with an endearing nervousness, pointing out his bearskin rugs, his collection of books, the root cellar where he kept supplies for winter. "It is not much," he said, "but it keeps the cold out, and the view is fine." "It is perfect," Josephine said, meaning it. After the cramped back room at her aunt's boarding house, this felt like a palace. That first night, Yates insisted she take the bed in the loft while he made a pallet by the fire. She lay awake for a long time, listening to the sounds of the mountain night, the wind in the pines, an owl calling somewhere distant, and the quiet breathing of the man below. She felt no fear, no regret, only peace. The days that followed fell into a new rhythm, one infinitely better than the old. Yates taught her about the mountains, showing her which plants were safe to eat, how to read weather in the clouds, where the best fishing holes lay along the creek. He was endlessly patient, never pushing her to talk more than she could manage, but she found her voice coming easier and easier in his presence. They talked about their pasts as they worked side by side. Yates told her about growing up in Missouri, about losing his family to cholera when he was 16 and heading west to escape the memories. He had tried mining, tried cattle work, and finally found his place in the mountains, trapping beaver and fox and living a life that made sense to him. "I never felt like I fit with other people," he admitted one evening as they sat by the fire. All that noise and expectation, everyone wanting you to be a certain way. Up here, I can just be myself. The mountains do not judge." "I understand that," Josephine said softly. "I always felt like everyone was waiting for me to explain myself, to justify taking up space, and I could not, so I just disappeared instead." "You do not disappear with me," Yates said, reaching over to take her hand. "With me, you are the loudest, brightest thing in the world." She leaned her head on his massive shoulder, feeling safe and seen in a way she never had before. A week passed, then two. Yates never pressured her, never made her feel like she owed him anything for taking her in. They slept separately, him by the fire and her in the loft, though Josephine found herself wishing more and more that things were different. She watched the way his muscles moved under his shirt when he chopped wood, the gentle way he handled his traps and his furs, the care he took with everything he did. She watched and felt her feelings deepen from gratitude to something much more profound. One evening in late October, as the aspens blazed gold in the fading light, Yates came back from checking his trapline to find Josephine cooking supper over the fire. She had made a stew with the rabbit he had brought the day before, and the smell filled the cabin. "That smells amazing," he said, hanging up his coat. "You are spoiling me, Josephine. I've been eating my own cooking for 5 years. This is a gift." She smiled at him over her shoulder. "I like taking care of you." Something shifted in his expression. He crossed the cabin in 3 long strides and turned her to face him, his hands on her shoulders. "Josephine, we need to talk about this, about us." Her heart started pounding. "What about us?" "I'm trying to be honorable. You came here for refuge, and I do not want to take advantage. But having you here, seeing you every day, hearing your voice, feeling how well we fit together, it is getting harder and harder to keep my distance." "Then do not," she whispered. "Do not what?" "Do not keep your distance." She put her hands on his chest, feeling his heart racing as fast as hers. "I did not come here just for refuge, Yates. I came here for you. Because I want to be with you. Because I think I am falling in love with you." His breath caught. "You think? Or you know?" "I know." Saying it out loud felt terrifying and liberating. "I love you, Yates Brennan. I love your patience and your kindness and the way you make me feel like I matter. I love how safe I feel with you and how you never try to make me into something I am not." "Josephine." Her name was a prayer on his lips. "I love you too. Have since the first day I saw you, I think. You looked so lost, and I just wanted to spend the rest of my life making sure you never felt that way again." He kissed her then, deeper than before, and Josephine felt heat uncurl in her belly. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, she made a decision. "Marry me," she said. Yates laughed, the sound full of joy. "I'm supposed to ask you that." "Then ask." He dropped to one knee right there in front of the fire, taking her hand in both of his. "Josephine Harper, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? I do not have a ring, and I cannot promise you an easy life, but I can promise to love you until my last breath, to protect you with everything I am, and to never take your voice for granted." "Yes," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, yes, yes." He stood and swept her into his arms, spinning her around the cabin until they were both dizzy and laughing. When he set her down, his expression turned serious. "We will need to go back to Santa Fe to make it proper. Find a priest or a minister, file the papers. I will not have anyone saying you are not my lawful wife." "When?" "Tomorrow, if you are willing. The sooner you are bound to me by law and God, the happier I will be." They left at dawn the next morning, riding double on Yates's big bay horse. Josephine wrapped her arms around his waist and rested her cheek against his broad back, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. It took them 2 hard days of riding to reach Santa Fe, camping one night under the stars with Yates's arms around her and his body shielding her from the cold. When they rode into the plaza, Josephine saw several people stop and stare. Word would spread quickly that she had come back with the mountain man, let them talk. She felt no shame, only pride to be with Yates. They went first to the old adobe church near the plaza. The priest, a kindly older man named Father Gonzalez, listened to their story with compassion. "I remember you, child," he said to Josephine. "You used to come to Mass with your aunt. She said you could not speak." "I can speak now," Josephine said clearly, "and I want to marry this man." Father Gonzalez looked at Yates, taking in his buckskin and furs, his long hair and weathered face, and then looked back at Josephine's radiant expression. "You are of age, and you come here of your own free will?" "I do." "Then I see no reason to refuse. But I must ask if your aunt approves." "She will not," Josephine admitted. "But I'm not asking her permission. I'm 20 years old, and this is my choice." The priest nodded slowly. "Very well. I will marry you this afternoon if you can find witnesses." That proved easier than expected. Miguel, hearing that they were in town, came to the church with his wife and 3 of his grown children, all delighted to serve as witnesses. Word spread, and by the time the ceremony began in the late afternoon, the church had filled with trappers and mountain men, traders and townspeople who knew Yates and wanted to see him wed. Mrs. Henderson came too, standing stiff and disapproving in the back. But Josephine barely noticed her aunt. Her entire world had narrowed to Yates, standing beside her in clean buckskin, with his hair tied back, his pale blue eyes locked on hers as they repeated their vows. When Father Gonzalez pronounced them man and wife, Yates kissed her with a tenderness that made the assembled crowd cheer. Josephine felt tears slip down her cheeks, but they were tears of pure joy. They stayed in Santa Fe one more night, in a small room at the inn, and Josephine became Yates's wife in truth as well as name. He was patient and gentle, guiding her through something she had never experienced, turning her nervousness into pleasure. Afterward, she lay in his arms, marveling at how her life had transformed in a matter of weeks. "I want to spend every day for the rest of my life making you happy," Yates murmured into her hair. "You already do," she whispered back, "just by being you." Before they left town the next morning, Mrs. Henderson appeared at the inn. Josephine tensed, but her aunt's expression was not quite as cold as usual. "I did not expect you to do this," Mrs. Henderson said. "I thought you would come to your senses." "I did come to my senses," Josephine replied. "I married a good man who loves me." Her aunt looked at Yates, who stood silently beside his new wife, his hand protective on her back. "You had better take care of her. She has no one else." "She has me," Yates said, "and I will protect her with my life." Mrs. Henderson nodded once, then turned and walked away. It was not a blessing, but it was not quite condemnation either, and Josephine decided to take it as the closest thing to acceptance her aunt could manage. They rode back into the mountains, back to the cabin that was now Josephine's home. As they traveled, Yates told her stories about the territory, about the summers when other trappers would gather for rendezvous, about the harsh winters when snow could pile 8 feet deep and the only sound for weeks was the wind. "It will get lonely sometimes," he warned, "especially in winter. We will be snowbound for months, just the 2 of us." "That sounds perfect," Josephine said, meaning it. The winter that followed was indeed harsh. Snow fell in November and did not melt until April. The cabin became their entire world, and Josephine learned what it meant to live with another person in such close quarters. There were moments of friction, times when Yates's silence grated on her, or when her moodiness when she struggled to find words frustrated him. But they worked through it, learning to communicate in ways that went beyond talking. They developed their own language of gestures and looks. A touch on the shoulder meant, "I am here." A particular tilt of the head meant, "Are you all right?" Shared work, shared meals, shared warmth in the bed they now openly shared every night. Josephine learned to tan furs, to sew mittens and coats from deerskin, to make soap from animal fat and lie. Yates taught her to shoot, and by midwinter she could hit a target with reasonable accuracy. He carved her more animals during the long evenings, creating a whole menagerie that she arranged on a shelf he built for her. A fox, a rabbit, an eagle, a bear. Each one perfect in its detail, each one a love letter written in wood. "You could sell these," she said one night, admiring a wolf he had just finished. "People would pay good money for work like this." "I only make them for you," Yates said. "They would not mean the same to anyone else." In late January, a blizzard hit that lasted 5 days. The wind howled like a living thing, and snow piled so high against the cabin walls that they had to dig a tunnel to reach the woodpile. Josephine had a moment of panic, feeling trapped, but Yates held her and told her stories about his childhood, about his mother who had loved to sing, and his father who had been able to fix anything that broke. "You never talk about them much," she said, her head on his chest. "It hurt for a long time," he admitted, losing them all at once, watching them die and being powerless to stop it. But up here, in the mountains, I found peace with it. And now, with you, I feel like I have a family again, like the empty place they left is filling back up. We could have children, Josephine said quietly, if you want them. She felt his heart rate pick up under her ear. You want children with me? More than anything. He rolled her beneath him, his eyes searching hers. Then we will have children, as many as you want, and they will grow up knowing they are loved, knowing these mountains, knowing how to be strong and gentle at the same time. They made love then with a new intentionality, and Josephine felt something shift, felt their future taking shape. Spring came with a rush of meltwater and wildflowers. The creek swelled to twice its size and the mountains exploded with color. Yates took Josephine exploring, showing her hidden valleys where elk grazed, high meadows carpeted with columbine, peaks that scraped the sky. She felt her spirit expanding to fill this vast space, felt herself becoming someone new, someone confident and capable. In June, she realized she was pregnant. She told Yates one evening as they sat outside the cabin watching the sunset paint the peaks gold and rose. He went very still, then whooped so loud it echoed off the mountains. He picked her up and spun her around, both of them laughing, and she felt happiness so complete it was almost painful. A baby, he kept saying. We are going to have a baby. Her pregnancy was easy in some ways, hard in others. Morning sickness plagued her for weeks, and as her belly swelled, she found it harder to do the physical work she had grown accustomed to. But Yates was endlessly patient, taking over the tasks that became too difficult, rubbing her aching back, making sure she ate even when she did not feel like it. In late summer, as the baby grew heavy inside her, Yates announced that they needed to go to Santa Fe. I want you near a midwife when your time comes, he said. I cannot risk anything happening to you or the baby. I will be fine, Josephine protested, but secretly she was relieved. The thought of giving birth in the isolated cabin with only Yates to help terrified her. They traveled to Santa Fe in early September, and Yates found them a small house to rent on the outskirts of town. He did not like being away from his mountains, but he never complained, just focused all his energy on making sure Josephine was comfortable. The baby came on a cool October evening, just as the sun was setting. Josephine labored for 12 hours with a midwife named Rosa coaching her through and Yates gripping her hand so hard she thought he might break her fingers. When their son finally entered the world, red-faced and screaming, Josephine looked at Yates and saw tears streaming down his face. A boy, he said, his voice choked. We have a son. They named him Samuel, after Yates' father. He was healthy and strong, with a shock of dark hair and his father's blue eyes. Yates held him like he was made of glass, his massive hands cradling the tiny body with infinite gentleness. I will protect you forever, Yates whispered to his son. You and your mama, that is my promise. They stayed in Santa Fe through the winter, partly because travel with an infant would be dangerous, partly because Josephine enjoyed being near other women for the first time in over a year. She made friends with Rosa and with several of the other mothers in town. She even reconciled, after a fashion, with her aunt, who came to visit and held baby Samuel with something approaching affection. You seem happy, Mrs. Henderson said, her tone making it clear this surprised her. I am, Josephine said simply. I thought you would regret it. Thought you would come crawling back begging for help. I know, but Yates is a good husband, and I love my life. Her aunt studied her for a long moment. You have changed. You are not the same frightened girl who got off that stagecoach. No, Josephine agreed. I am not. When spring came, they packed up and returned to the mountains. Samuel was 6 months old, a cheerful baby who seemed to love the journey, looking around with wide eyes at the towering pines and crystal creeks. The cabin felt different with a baby in it, louder and more chaotic, but Josephine loved every moment. Yates proved to be a devoted father. He wore Samuel in a sling while he worked, sang to him in the evenings, carved him rattles and toys. He built a cradle that rocked gently, and later a small chair and table for when Samuel was old enough to sit up. The years passed in a blur of seasons. Samuel grew into a sturdy boy with his father's build and his mother's thoughtful nature. When he was 3, Josephine became pregnant again, and they had a daughter they named Grace, after Yates's mother. She had Josephine's dark hair and delicate features, but Yates's fearless spirit. They had one more child, another son named Thomas, born when Samuel was 7 and Grace was 4. By then, Josephine had become so comfortable in her mountain life that she could barely remember the shy, silent girl she had once been. She could talk easily with the few trappers who lived nearby, could trade in Santa Fe without fear, could discipline her children and teach them lessons and tell them stories. But her voice was still softest, still most natural when she spoke to Yates. With him, words were still sometimes unnecessary. They had learned to communicate in the language of long married couples, in glances and touches, in the way their bodies moved together in the night, in the shared rhythm of their days. One evening, when Samuel was 10 and beginning to learn the trap lines, when Grace was 7 and already showing signs of her mother's artistic talent, when Thomas was 3 and constantly underfoot, Yates and Josephine sat outside the cabin watching the sunset. The children were playing by the creek, their laughter echoing off the mountains. "Do you ever regret it?" Yates asked, "giving up the chance at an easier life?" Josephine looked at him, at the silver threading through his dark hair, at the new lines around his eyes, at the strong, gentle man she had loved for over a decade. She thought about that terrified girl in the plaza, unable to speak, unable to imagine a future. She thought about the moment she had whispered his name, the moment everything had changed. "Never," she said, "not for a single second." He smiled and pulled her close, and they sat in comfortable silence as the light faded and the stars began to emerge. Their children's voices carried on the evening air, and somewhere a coyote called, and the mountains stood eternal around them. This was the life she had been meant for, Josephine thought, not the one her aunt had tried to force on her, not the one society said a woman should want, but this one, wild and difficult and beautiful, with a man who had been patient enough to wait for her to find her voice. "I love you," she whispered, and the words were as easy as breathing now. "I love you too," Yates said. "Always have, always will." They raised their children to love the mountains the way they did. Samuel grew into a tall, strong man who took over his father's trap lines when Yates's joints grew stiff with age. He married a woman from Santa Fe, a teacher named Margaret, and brought her back to the mountains where she proved to be as capable and fearless as Josephine had become. Grace inherited her mother's initial shyness, but she also inherited Josephine's talent for finding her voice when it mattered. She became known throughout the territory for her paintings, capturing the beauty of the mountains on canvas. She never married, preferring her independence, and built herself a cabin a mile from her parents, where she lived and painted and thrived. Thomas was the adventurer, leaving the mountains when he turned 18 to explore California and Oregon. But he always came back, drawn by the pull of home, and eventually settled in Santa Fe, where he opened a trading post that catered to the mountain men his father had once counted as neighbors. The years turned into decades. Yates's hair went completely silver, and his body, while still strong, moved slower. Josephine's face gained lines, and her dark hair went gray, but Yates still looked at her like she was the most beautiful thing in the world. They had grandchildren, a whole brood of them, who loved visiting the mountain cabin and hearing stories about the old days. One evening in late summer, when Josephine was 62 and Yates was 65, they sat in the same spot where they had spent countless evenings, watching the sunset paint the peaks. Yates's breathing had been labored lately, and Josephine knew with the certainty born of 40 years together that their time was growing short. "It has been a good life," Yates said, his voice rough but content. "Better than I ever dreamed." "The best life," Josephine agreed, her hand tight in his. "I would not change a thing." "I am glad you came to find me," he said. "Glad you were brave enough to walk away from safety and come looking for a rough mountain man who did not have much to offer." "You had everything to offer," she said fiercely. "You gave me myself, Yates. You gave me my voice and my courage and a love I never thought I would find." He turned to look at her, his blue eyes still clear and bright despite his age. "Say my name again, like you did that first time." "Yates," she whispered, just as she had 42 years ago. "Yates Brennan, my love." He smiled, that same smile that had melted her heart all those years ago, and squeezed her hand. They sat together as the light faded, as it had faded thousands of times before. But this time felt different. This time felt like an ending and a completion both. Yates died in his sleep that night, peacefully, with Josephine's arms around him. She woke at dawn to find him still and cold, and though grief crashed over her like a wave, there was comfort in knowing he had died as he had lived, in the mountains he loved, with the woman he loved beside him. She buried him on the mountain in a spot overlooking the valley where they had built their life together. Their children and grandchildren came, and they stood together while Father Gonzalez, ancient now but still serving his church, said prayers over the grave. Josephine stayed in the cabin after Yates died. Samuel tried to convince her to move in with him and Margaret, and Thomas offered her a room in Santa Fe, but she refused. This was where she belonged, where she could feel Yates's presence in every corner, in the carvings he had made her over the years, in the bed they had shared, in the view from the porch. She lived another 5 years, and they were not lonely years despite her solitude. Her children and grandchildren visited often, and she spent her days tending the garden, walking the trails she and Yates had walked together, and remembering. She talked to him sometimes, out loud, her voice still strongest when speaking to him, even though he was gone. On a clear October day, with the aspens blazing gold just as they had the autumn she had arrived, Josephine sat on the porch and felt her heart slow in her chest. She was 67, and she was ready. She closed her eyes and whispered one last time, "Yates." They buried her beside him on the mountain. The whole family gathered again, 3 generations of the life that had begun when a shy girl had found the courage to whisper a mountain man's name. Their great-grandchildren played among the trees while the adults mourned, and the mountain stood witness, eternal and unchanging. Years later, hikers would sometimes stumble across 2 weathered graves on a mountainside in the Sangre de Cristo range. The wooden markers had been replaced with stone by caring descendants, and the inscriptions were simple. Yates Brennan, 1811-1876, beloved husband, father, grandfather. He waited patiently. Josephine Brennan, 1856-1923, beloved wife, mother, grandmother. She found her voice. And between them, carved into a 3rd stone placed by their children, a single line that captured their entire story. She whispered his name, and he heard her heart. The cabin still stood, maintained by descendants who understood that some places hold too much love to be abandoned. The carvings Yates had made still sat on their shelf, a menagerie frozen in time. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind whispered through the pines, people swore they could hear voices, gentle and content, speaking in the language of love that transcends words. It was a love story written in patience and courage, in whispered names and carved wood, in the wild beauty of mountains that had witnessed 2 souls finding each other against all odds. It was the story of a girl too shy to speak who found a man willing to wait, and together they built a life that echoed through generations. The mountains remembered, the wind carried their names, and their love, born in silence and grown through patience, remained as enduring as the peaks themselves, a testament to the transformative power of finding someone who hears not just your voice, but your heart.